This is the discussion of 2019 A-level Economics MCQ paper. We will start with question 1. The first question says, the branch of economics that studies the decisions of individual households and firms is called. Okay, see that now. The most important part here in this question is, this particular branch of economics studies about individual households, individual firms. If not, in other words, we just study tiny pieces, components of the economy. So how do we recognize this branch of economics in which we study individual economic variables? That we recognize as microeconomics. So this is very easy. The answer is the second one. And if it is the branch of economics that studies the aggregates, we recognize that to be the macroeconomics, right? So these are the two branches we have in economics, macroeconomics and microeconomics. So no point of discussing about the other provided options. So somehow for this question 1, since we just focus on individual households and individual firms, the answer is the second one, microeconomics. Right. Second question says, the income payments made to resource owners of land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. This is once again another very easy question. Even in O-level commerce, you have this stuff, right? So the payment for land we recognize as rent, right? That is rent. And the payment for labor we recognize as wages. The payment of capital we recognize as interest, and the payment of entrepreneurship we recognize as profit. So rent, wages, interest, and profit. Answer is the fourth one. Right. Look at this question 3. Which of the following is a salient feature of a common economic system? Right. If it's a common economic system, mainly we have these features. The first one, we say properties are owned by the public sector. And the basic economic problems are solved through the planning mechanism, right? They are solved through planning mechanism. And third one, incentives are based on social welfare. So these are the main pillars, if not these are the characteristics of a common economic system. Right. We'll read the given options. The first one, private ownership of capital. See, this is a salient feature in free market economies. Second one, heavy reliance on markets. Once again, this is a characteristic in free market economy. The third one, central planning. See, I told you that these economies solve their basic economic problems using planning mechanism. So central planning authority makes all the decisions related to what to produce in what quantity, how to produce, and whom to produce for. So central planning is a salient feature in common economic systems. The fourth one says concentration of market power. See, concentration of market power is not a salient feature even in a free market economy. No, it's not. And the fifth one, decision making based on self-interest. This is a salient feature in free market economy. So from the provided 5 options, the answer for this question 3 is the third one. Right. Look at this fourth one. The diagram below shows production possibility frontier for an economy producing at point A. See, right now the economy is at point A, which means the economy produces 800 units of good Y and just 100 units of good X. And by giving this, what do they ask us to calculate? What is the quantity of good X given up to produce the quantity of good Y? Okay, so as we saw earlier, right now the economy is producing 800 units of good Y and just 100 units of good X. Now the question asks us to recognize the quantity of good X that is given up to produce the given quantity of good Y. Just assume that this economy does not produce a single unit of good Y and it produces only good X. If so, the economy can operate at this point and if you look at the amount that is produced from good X, right, we see 300, which means if the economy does not allocate a single resource to produce this good Y, they can produce 300 units of good X, right? They can produce 300 units of good X. But the problem now, in this economy, they have allocated some of the resources to produce 800 units of good Y. And as a result, they can only produce just 100 units of good X. Right? As per the previous discussion, they could have produced 300 from good X if they do not produce a single unit of good Y. But as a result of producing 800 units of good Y, they can only produce 100. So how much has this economy sacrificed in terms of good X? They have sacrificed the difference between 300 and 100, because they could have produced 300, but right now they are producing only 100, which means the economy has sacrificed 200 units of good X to produce 800 units of good Y. So the answer for this question 4 is the second one. Right, look at this question 5. This says the table below shows substitution effect and income effect of a price change of good X. And for the time being, we don't know whether this good X is a normal good or an inferior good. So it can be any. And then it says, which one of the following represents the correct combination of substitution and income effects? All right. So look at this one. Type of good X. Okay. The first one we see is inferior. Right. If the good is inferior, imagine that the price decreases. Good is inferior. Let me write here. Good is inferior and price decreases. Good is inferior, price drops. And the quantity demanded due to substitution effect. So what do we mean by this term substitution effect? This means what happens to the quantity demanded of the good as a result of relative price change of the considered good. So let me write here relative price. When the price of the considered good changes, its relative price changes. Simply, the considered good becomes relatively cheaper or relatively expensive. And as a result, the quantity demanded also changes. Either consumers move from a substitute to the considered good, or the consumers move from the considered good to the substitute. So that is what happens, and that's what we discuss under substitution effect. Right. Now just imagine that this is an inferior good, and for some reason the market price decreases. And when the market price decreases, it doesn't matter whether the good is inferior or not. What happens to its relative price? The good becomes relatively cheaper compared to the available substitutes. This particular good becomes relatively cheaper. So the relative price also decreases. So when compared with the other substitutes, when the price of this product reduces, it becomes relatively cheaper, so that the consumers move from those substitutes to the considered good. They avoid using those substitutes and they start using the considered good, so that as a result, the quantity demanded of the considered good increases. Clear? So this is what happens under substitution effect. So let me write here substitution effect. So when we consider the substitution effect, we first need to recognize what happens to the relative price, and as a result, what happens to the quantity demanded. All right. So that's about the first one, and we'll check this with the provided answer. Right. The price of the inferior good falls, and as per the discussion we had, the quantity demanded due to substitution effect should increase, but this says that the price decreases. Sorry, the QD value decreases, which is wrong. And quantity demanded due to income effect. Okay, so when you think about this income effect, let me write here income effect. It's about what happens to the quantity demanded as a result of changing consumers' real income. So think about it in this way. When the price of the good falls, consumers' real income increases. But remember, we are referring to an inferior good. So if the real income increases, what happens to the quantity demanded? It decreases, right? Quantity demanded decreases. But what does the answer say? It says that the quantity demanded due to income effect increases. No, again, wrong. Right. Now, think about the second one. Again, the good is inferior. This time the price increases. Right. Let's see what will happen if the price increases. Right. Now, the market price increases so that the relative price of the product also increases, which means simply the product becomes relatively expensive compared with the other substitutes available in the market. The price of this product increases, so this becomes relatively expensive. Now what happens to the quantity demand? Now consumers start moving from considered good to the substitutes. They find other relatively cheaper substitutes and they move away from the considered good, so that the quantity demanded of the considered good decreases. Right? Now we will discuss what happens under income effect as well. Okay, so once again, when the price increases, consumers' real income, what happens to his real income? Real income decreases. So as a result of decrease in this real income, right? Remember again, this is an inferior good. So when the real income decreases, there is a negative relationship between income and the quantity demanded, or the in general income and the demand, so that when the real income decreases, QD increases. Right. Now we will compare this with the provided answer. Right. The second option says the product is inferior, the price increases. If so, what should happen to the quantity demanded under substitution effect? The quantity demanded should decrease, and that has happened. That's true. The next one, quantity demanded due to income effect. As per the discussion, we understood that the quantity demanded due to income effect should go up, it should increase. But this says that it decreases, so that this answer is also wrong. Right. Now look at this third one. Type of the good is inferior. Once again, the same thing. The price rises. Okay, if the price increases, what needs to happen to the quantity demanded due to substitution effect? See, due to the substitution effect, the quantity demanded should decrease, but this says that it increases, which is wrong. And look at the last part, quantity demanded due to income effect. So when the price increases, the quantity demanded due to income effect should increase, and this is correct. But since this part is wrong, the whole option, the provided answer, is wrong. Right. Look at the fourth one, type of the good. So this is a normal good. So it doesn't matter whether the good is inferior or normal, the substitution effect works in the same way. Now, for example, right? So this is the discussion related to inferior goods, and let me write here normal goods. Right. Now, if there's a normal good and if the price decreases, as I mentioned earlier, the relative price also decreases, which means the product becomes relatively cheaper compared to the other substitutes. So that what will happen, the consumers will move from those substitutes to the considered good, so that the quantity demanded of the consumer good will increase. And now focus on the income effect. So this is a normal good and the price of the product decreases, so that the real income goes up, right? Real income increases. And when real income increases, since this is a normal good, even the QD value will increase. Right. Now we will look at the provided answer. It's a normal good, price falls as per the discussion we had. And then the quantity demanded due to substitution effect. See that now, the quantity demanded due to substitution effect should increase. And it says, yes, it increases. And quantity demanded due to income effect. See that now, the quantity demanded due to income effect should also increase. And it says that. So that in this fourth option, all the four columns are 100% correct. So this is the answer for this question 5. But if you look at the fifth one, it says it's a normal good, okay, and the price increases. Okay, wait, let me explain this thing. imagine that the opposite happens now. The price of the normal good increases, right? So once again, let me take this here. So the price of the normal good increases so that the relative price also increases, which means the price, if not this product, becomes relatively expensive compared to the other substitutes available in the market. So that the consumers will move from the considered good to those relatively cheaper substitutes. So what will happen to the quantity demanded of the considered good? That will decrease. And on the other side, we get the income effect. So when the price increases, the real income definitely decreases. When the real income decreases, since this is a normal good, what happens? The consumers reduce the quantity demanded as well. So that's what happens. Now, if you compare this thing with the provided answer, it says quantity demanded due to substitution effect. See, it says increases, which is wrong. See, as per the discussion we had, we can understand that it should decrease. And under the quantity demanded due to income effect, under income effect, they say that it should, QD should decrease. Yes, it's true. QD should decrease, but somehow this middle part of this answer is wrong. So that the whole option is wrong. So answer for this question 5 is this fourth one. Right. We will move to the sixth question. There it says, which of the following would shift the supply curve of a good to the left? Okay. So if there's a leftward shift of the supply curve, wait. Imagine that this is the initial supply curve, and after the leftward shift, this is our new supply curve. So what has happened to the supply? If the supply curve gets shifted to the left side, we say supply reduces, supply decreases. Supply has decreased, right? So let me write supply decreases. And we just need to recognize the reason for this decrease in supply. All right, the first one, an increase in the cost of production. See that now, when the cost increases, the producers can't produce higher number of quantities. So that when the cost increases, what happens to the supply? Supply decreases. So this itself is the answer for this question 6. But we will go through the other options as well. Second one says a decrease in the cost of production. See that now, if the production cost decreases, the producers can increase their supply. If supply increases, supply curve will shift to the right side, not to the left side. So this is wrong there. The third one, an increase in the price of a good. See that now, an increase in the price of a good. See that now. The fourth one, a decrease in the price of a good. When the price of the good increases or decreases, remember it influences on the quantity supplied, not the supply itself. Right? So to be more precise, if I explain this third one, when the price increases, the quantity supplied will increase, not the supply. And when the price of the good decreases, the quantity supplied will decrease, not the supply. So that we can't consider any of these to be the answers because they influence on the QS value, quantity supply, not the supply itself. The fifth one says decrease in demand. See that now, demand and supply, those are independent. Right? When demand changes, nothing happens to the supply. So those are independent variables. So that the answer for this question 6 is the first one. Right. Now look at this question 7. It says, if the demand for public transport decreases when person's income increases. See, we discussed this under question number 5. Hope you remember. Now what happens to the person's income? Income increases, right? And then the demand for public transport, whatever, the demand decreases. So if you look at the two variables change in the opposite directions. When one increases, the other one decreases. So that we can recognize that there is a negative relationship between consumers' income, Y, and the demand. If so, how do we recognize, how do we label these goods? We label them as inferior goods, right? We label them as inferior goods, right? So answer is first one, and that's very easy. So no need to discuss the other options as well. Right, now look at this question 8. This says the diagram below shows the market demand curve for good X, okay? And then change in market equilibrium quantity from point A to point B. Okay, equilibrium changes from A to B, which means even if they haven't shown this thing, we need to assume that this is where the equilibrium, the initial equilibrium was, so that the supply curve must be here then, right? And then this equilibrium changes from point A to point B, which means there is only one possible reason for that. What's that possible reason? The supply curve has shifted, right? The supply curve has shifted to the right side. Now this is the second supply curve. If the supply curve gets shifted to the right side, now the equilibrium changes. See, equilibrium quantity changes from point A to point B. And most likely be caused by, okay, this change. What's the reason for this change? Now we recognize what needs to happen for this change. The supply should increase, right? Supply should increase. So under this previous question, I think under the previous question 6, we just found the reasons for a decrease in supply, for a leftward shift of the supply curve. Now here we just need to do the opposite, right? You just need to recognize the reason for an increase in supply, for a rightward shift in the supply curve. Right, now look at the first one. An increase in price of a substitute product. See that now it influences on the demand, not on the supply. So that's wrong. An increase in consumers' income. See, even consumers' income is a determinant of demand, not a determinant of supply. So that is again wrong. A decrease in consumers' income. See, same story. It is a determinant of demand, not a determinant of supply. The fourth one, a decrease in the cost of production of good X. Simply the opposite of what we discussed here in question 6, right? Here in question 6. So what happens when the production cost decreases? Suppliers can produce more, right? Suppliers can produce more, so that as a result, supply will increase, so that the supply curve will shift to the right side. And when that happens, the equilibrium quantity will move from point A to point B. So that is the answer that we were looking for. And the fifth one, a decrease in supply of a good. See, if a decrease happens, the supply curve gets shifted to the left side, then the quantity, I mean equilibrium quantity changes this way, not A to B. It changes upward, not downwards. So that is not the answer there. Right. Ninth one. Assume a hypothetical competitive market which is in equilibrium at rupees 100 per unit. Now assume that the market supply curve changes from being elastic at each price to become inelastic at each price, and the market equilibrium does not change. Okay, very interesting. So this is what happens here. Imagine that this is the quantity axis and here we get the price axis. Just imagine that the initial supply curve is elastic, right? It is initially elastic. So this is the demand curve, and if the supply is initially elastic, it should start from the price axis. So this is the supply curve. And based on this elastic supply and the typical demand curve, equilibrium price is decided as rupees 100, right? Okay, then what happens? The supply curve changes from being elastic to inelastic, and the question asks us to recognize what is the effect of this change on consumer surplus and producer surplus. All right. So let me copy this diagram. Right now, wait, I'll show you the consumer surplus and the producer surplus in the initial situation. So you all can understand, right? So this part of the diagram we recognize as the consumer surplus, right? That is the consumer surplus. And then the region below the price received by the producer, above the supply curve, up to the quantity traded in the market, that we recognize as the producer surplus. But now, you know what happens? The supply curve, the shape of the supply curve changes. It changes this way. It is at the same, it must be, I mean, the central point must be at the same point, because nothing happens to the equilibrium, but the supply curve becomes more inelastic now. Right now, the supply curve becomes much more steeper, and now it starts from the quantity axis, so that now you can understand that this supply curve, right? So let me draw it in a different color pen. So this supply curve is relatively inelastic compared to the initial supply curve. The new one is inelastic, and when that happens, right, I'm asking this question from you all. Now you just tell me what happened to the consumer surplus. What is the consumer surplus? That is the region above the market price, below the demand curve, up to the equilibrium quantity. So previously we just shaded that in green color. So if I shade that same region again, sorry, if I use that same color to shade the region, you can recognize that nothing has happened to that region, which means even if the supply curve changes from being elastic to inelastic, what happened to the consumer supply? Nothing happened. But remember, what's the producer surplus? That is the region below the price received by the producer, above the supply curve, up to the quantity that is traded in the market. So this is the new supply curve. So the producer surplus has to be above that supply curve. It has to be below the price received by this producer, which is 100. It has to be the region below that, up to the quantity traded in the market. See what has happened to this region that we have shaded in blue color. If you compare the first diagram with the second diagram, what has happened to that blue color region? That has increased, which means if the supply changes from being elastic to inelastic, nothing happens to the consumer surplus, but producer surplus has increased. So that's the answer. Nothing happens to consumer surplus. It remains unchanged, but the producer surplus should increase, so that the answer for this question 9 is the third one. Hope you understand that. Very interesting, right? So the 10th one, the diagram below shows the market demand and supply curves for a normal good. Okay, so this is where we get the initial equilibrium, and yeah, so they have given us another price as well. We get the demand curve, supply curve. Okay, we'll read this. It says the market equilibrium price could rise from P1 to P2. Okay, so once again, they just spoke about the equilibrium price. Previously, hope you remember this question. Here, they just told us that the equilibrium quantity changes from point A to point B. But now, they are referring to the equilibrium price, right? Equilibrium price changes from P1 to P2. This is also interesting. ටිකක් ගති. ඇයි දැන් අපි කලින් කතා කළේ it's a change in the quantity, right? Equilibrium quantity changes from point A to point B, so that the only possible reason here is the supply, the change in the supply. The supply, if supply increases, the supply curve gets shifted to the right side, and as a result, right, the equilibrium quantity changes from point A to point B, and that's the only possible reason in this given case. But if you once again look at this question 10, now they are referring to the equilibrium price. So this has to be the new equilibrium price. So for this to become the new equilibrium price, what changes can happen in the market? What changes can happen in the market? ඔයාලා හැමෝටම වගේ මුලින්ම පේනවයි කියලා මම හිතන එක. Right? if the equilibrium price changes from P1 to P2, ඔයාලා හැමෝටම මුලින් පේනවා කියලා මට හිතෙන්නේ an increase in demand will do that කියලා. See, if this is the first demand curve and if this is our second demand curve, when demand increases, see that now the previous equilibrium price was at P1, but the new equilibrium price is at P2, right? So is it the only possible reason for this change in equilibrium price? No. But before I show you the other one, wait, let me write this one here. One possible reason is demand increase or increase in demand. All right? Increase in demand is one possible reason. And the other possible reason is, that is interesting, see that now, even if the supply decreases from this to this, right? Even if the supply decreases, what happens once again? The equilibrium price increases from P1 to P2. එතකොට ඔයා කියයි ඉතින් එතකොට සර් equilibrium quantity අරක වෙනවා මේක වෙනවා ප්‍රශ්නයක් නෑනේ මොකක් වුණා ඇයි මොකද question එකේ කිසිම දෙයක් ඒ ගැන කියන්නේ නෑ ඉතින් ඒ නිසා ඕන දෙයක් වෙන්න පුළුවන් for equilibrium quantity හැබැයි question එකේ කියන දේ මෙතනදිත් ඒ විදිහටම වෙනවා if the supply curve gets shifted to the left side, which means if supply decreases, right? So let me write decrease in supply. මේ දෙකෙන් කොයික වුණත් what will happen in the market? The equilibrium price will move from P1 to P2. එහෙනම් අපි අඳුරගත්තා either the demand must increase, if not the supply must decrease. ඔය දෙකෙන් එකක් වෙනවා නම් මේ වැඩේ වෙයි. දැන් අපි තේරුම් ගන්න ඕන දේ තමයි මේ දෙකෙන් එකක් වෙන්නේ මෙතන තියෙන මොන ඔප්ෂන් එකකින්ද කියන එක. Right. Consumers income increase. So this is a normal good. So if it's a normal good, when consumers income increases, what happens to the demand? Even the demand increases. So that අපිට ඕන දේ වුණා ඒ නිසා this is the answer for this question tip. දැන් මම කිව්වේ මොකද්ද? Either the demand should increase, if not the supply should decrease. But as a result of this, as a result of increase in this consumer income, see, demand increases, and when demand increases, demand curve gets shifted to the right side, so that the price increases from P1 to P2. Right. හැබැයි මෙතන තියෙන අනිත් ඒවා දැන් කතා කරලා තියෙන එක්ක මේක වෙන්නේ නැහැ නැත්නම් මේක වෙන්නේ නැහැ. කතා කරලා මම පෙන්නන්නම් බලා ගන්න. Second one, the price of the complementary product increased. So when the price of the complementary good increases, what happens to the demand? It influences on demand definitely. So what happens to the demand if the price of the complementary good increases? Demand will decrease. Not that it increases. Demand will decrease. The demand of the considered good will decrease. ඉතින් ඔයා හිතලා බලන්නකෝ ඒක සාමාන්‍ය කතන්දරයක්නේ. ඔයා pizza price බලනවා අනිත් පැත්තෙන් Coca-Cola demand බලනවා. So when the price of a pizza get increased, what happens to the demand of Coca-Cola? අර pizza එකත් එක්ක විකුණන Coca-Cola bottle එකට මොකද වෙන්නේ? ඒක අඩු වෙනවා. සරල දේවල්නේ. එතකොට එහෙනම් as a result of this demand decreases. එතකොට අපිට වුණා දේ වෙන්නේ අපිට ඕන demand increase වෙන්න. So this is not the answer there. The third one, cost of production was substantially lowered. See, if the same point, now this is the third question that we find here in this paper itself, right? So cost of the production, if the production cost decreases, it will result in increase in supply, not a decrease in supply. හැබැයි අපිට වෙන්න ඕනේ මොකද්ද? Supply should decrease. හැබැයි as a result of production cost being lower, the supply may increase, right? Supply will increase. So this is not the answer there. Fourth one, subsidies on the product. See the now, if the government provides a subsidy to the producers, what will happen? The supply will again increase. හැබැයි අපිට ඕන supply එක decrease වෙන්න. එහෙනම් this is also not the answer. Fifth one, price P2 was set as a legally maximum price. If it is a legally maximum price, එහෙම price එකක් impose කරපුවා හරිම ඒ කියන්නේ හොඳ නැහැ, set නැහැ. මොකද if it is an effective maximum price, it has to be a price lower than the equilibrium price, initial equilibrium price. ඒතර මේ වගේ එකක් තමයි අපි අඳුරගන්නේ maximum price කියලා. ඒතර මේ වගේ එකක් maximum price වෙන්නේ නැහැ. That is not an effective maximum price. So that is then totally ignorable. So the answer is the first one. Right, now look at this question 11. In question 11, it says, assume that in a private higher education institute, internet service at first was made available to its student at no cost. See, which means the price is simply zero, right? The market price, if not the price paid by the consumer, is simply zero. Later on, the institute decided to charge rupees 100 per hour for the internet users, and the demand curve for the internet service is shown in the diagram below. See, when the price is increased to 100, from 0 to 100, what has happened to the usage? What has happened to the quantity demanded? That has reduced, right? That has reduced. The value of the loss in consumer surplus after the introduction of hourly charge. Very simple, right? The loss in consumer surplus. So as I always tell you, what is the consumer surplus? I mean, which region is that? How do we define that region? How do we recognize that region? That is the region below the demand curve, above the price paid by the consumer, up to the quantity that is traded in the market. So if the price is zero, this is the price paid by the consumer. So this is the market quantity, that is the quantity traded in the market. So the region below the demand curve and above this up to the quantity traded in the market. So this whole triangle, right? This whole triangle presents the consumer surplus at the initial situation. But after introducing this 100 charge, the price paid by the consumer is 100 and the quantity traded in the market is 200, and the region below the demand curve above the market price up to the quantity traded in the market. See, previously it was this whole triangle, but now the consumer surplus is limited only up to this smaller triangle. And they ask us to recognize a loss in consumer surplus. එක චුට්ටක් විතර ඒ කියන්නේ loss නේ චුට්ටක් විතර mathematics වල මේ වගේ ඒවායේ area එක හොයලා තියෙන ඕන තරම්. So this is the loss in consumer surplus. So how do we find this area? Hope you remember that equation. If not, just listen to this. What මතක් වෙයි එතකොට? So how do we find this region shaded in green color? You take half into, right? You get the distance from here to here, which means that is the distance from 0 to 200. So the distance is 200 plus, now you get the distance from here to here, which is 600, and that you multiplied by the height of this thing, which is 100. So what happens now? This is half into 800 into 100, which is simply 400 into 100. So 400, another two zeros, answer is 40,000. See, 40,000 is the answer. So for the question 11, third one is the answer. Look at this question 12 now. Yeah, table එක දැක්කම මට මතක් වුණේ අතරම we had a similar question in a previous past paper as well, but no problem, we will discuss this thing. The table below shows the demand and supply schedules for a consumer good before and after the imposition of a unit tax on production. Right, what was the tax per unit and the amount of price change after tax? හරි, ඒ කියන්නේ අපෙන් අහන්නේ පළවෙනි දේ තමයි tax per unit, ඊළඟට amount of price change after tax. හරි, සරල සිද්ධියක්. එතකොට අපි මෙන්න මෙහෙම දෙයක් කරමු. So if you look at this table very consciously, right, you can see that these are the, we don't need this one for the time being, but these are the quantities supplied before tax, and here you see the quantities supplied after tax. right? So I'll first show you how to find this tax per unit, and then I'll show you how to find this thing, right? So these are the quantities supplied before tax, and these are the quantities supplied after tax. Right now, you just pick, let's say, for example, you pick this 550, right? So before imposing the tax, the suppliers were able to provide 550 units to the market at a price of rupees 65. They only wanted rupees 65 to provide 550 units to the market. But now you see here, to provide that same quantity, same 550 units, to provide that same quantity, now they need rupees 75. Right? Now they need rupees 75. But why is that? Now they need rupees 75 from the market. Why is that? Because after tax, they collect this 75 from the market. They pay a certain amount to the government as the tax, so that they can keep that remaining 65, I mean the balance 65 with them. එහෙනම් government එකට tax එක විදියට කොච්චරක් ගෙවලා ඇතිද? Government එකට tax එක විතර ගෙවන්නේ the difference between these two. They collect 75 from the market and they pay 10 rupee tax to the government, and the balance 65 goes into their pocket. So they can again supply 550 units. මොකද even in the previous situation also, if they receive 65, they were ready to supply 550. දැනුත් ඒක එහෙමම තමයි. But the problem, this time they expect rupees 75 from the market. මොකද ඒගොල්ලන්ට අර මැද තියෙන tax එක ගෙවන්න ඕන නිසා. ඒ නිසා tax per unit has to be how much? 10. See, ඔයා උතන 550ම select කරන්න ඕනේ නෑ. ඔයා වෙන මොන value එක select කළාද ඒක ඔච්චර තමයි වෙන්නේ. ඒ කියන්නේ for example, imagine that you select this 700. So previously, to provide 700 to the market, they wanted rupees 80. But now, to provide that same quantity to the market, they expect rupees 90. Why? Because they need to pay this balance to the government as the tax. So once again, you get the same amount as the tax, 10. So koi values එක select කරලා ප්‍රශ්නයක් නෑ. Okay, so that is just one part of this question, right? Now we found the amount of tax, the per unit tax, that's just him. And so our answer has to be either this, if not this, if not the fifth one. But see, they ask us to recognize the amount of price change after tax, right? Amount of price change after tax. මම මුලින්ම ඔයාලට කතන්දර දෙකක් කියනවා. මුලින් මේ පළවෙනි කතාව අහගන්නකො. පළවෙනි කතාවේ මොකද්ද? Based on the QD and QS, you can recognize the equilibrium to be how much? See, QD becomes equal to QS when the price is 75. Right? When the price is 75. හැබැයි after this, right, after the tax, මොකද වෙන්නේ? QD becomes equal to QS here. This is QD and this is the new QS. So these two become equal when the price is 85. ඒ නිසා දැන් මම කියන කතන්දර දෙකක් කියන කියලා මම තාම කියන්නේ පළවෙනි කතාව. ඒ නිසා now you can recognize previously the equilibrium price was 75, but now the equilibrium price is 85. So that the price change after tax is rupees 10. ඔය මම කිව්වේ පළවෙනි කතාවනේ. ඕක අඳුර ගන්න පුළුවන්. දෙවෙනි කතන්දරේ තමයි හරිම ලේසි එක. හැබැයි ඔයාලට ඒකට ඉකෝන් පුළුවන් වෙන්න ඕන. මේකටත් ඉතින් ඉකෝන් ඕනි. හැබැයි මේකට ඊට වඩා චිප්ටක් විතර ඕන. See, look at the values taken under quantity demanded column. By looking at these values, you can understand a certain quality of the demand. What is that quality? See, even if the price changes, nothing happens to the quantity demanded, which means in this given situation, demand is perfectly inelastic. Right? Demand is perfectly inelastic. And if demand is perfectly inelastic, perfectly inelastic නැතත් අපි නිකමට හිතමුකෝ if the demand is just inelastic compared with the supply. If so, the consumer needs to bear up a higher burden of the tax. හැබැයි if the demand is perfectly inelastic, that is the extreme case. So when the demand is perfectly inelastic, the entire tax burden, not a higher tax burden, but the entire tax burden is borne by the consumer. The නිසා tax එක 10යි නම් මුළු tax එකම ගෙවන්නේ consumer නම් market price එක tax එකේ amount එකෙම වැඩි වෙනවා. එහෙනම් කලින් ආවෙත් අපේ equilibrium price එකේ change එක 10 කියලා අපි ඔය විදිහට හිතලා බැලුවට පස්සේ if the market price increases by the same amount of tax, the price change has to be once again same 10. So the answer for this question is the second one. ඔන්න කතන්දර දෙකම මම කිව්වා. හිතලා බලන්න ඔයාලට ඔක තේරුම් නැත්නම් ඔයත් හිතලා බලන්න. Right, 13th one. It says the diagram below shows a competitive market for an agricultural commodity. Okay, so see the now. By looking at the diagrams, again you can understand a certain quality with regard to demand and supply both. See, the supply curve starts from the quantity axis, and why is that? Because supply is inelastic, right? Supply is inelastic, and see the slope of the demand curve. This is less steeper, right? The demand curve compared to a demand curve like this, right? This is less steeper, so that the demand is elastic, right? Demand is elastic, right? Now let's get into the question. After recognizing these two qualities, we can discuss this thing properly. The question says, if the government grants per unit subsidy, okay, this time the government is offering a subsidy to the producers of this commodity. How will economic surplus be distributed between producers and consumers? What මතකද මම දෙයක් කිව්වා මෙතනදී. I told you that if demand is relatively inelastic, I mean if demand is inelastic compared to supply, right? If a tax is imposed, the consumer is going to bear up a higher portion of the tax. Again, mama sarlaව අදහස් කරන්නේ, if demand is inelastic and if it's a tax, consumer bears a higher portion of the tax. And if the supply is inelastic and if it's a tax, again the supplier bears a higher portion of the tax. ඒ කියන්නේ inelastic වෙන්නේ මොන පාටි එකද? එක tax එකක් නම් ඒ පාටි එක තමයි ඒ tax එකේ major part එක bear up කරන්නේ. ඒකේ අනිත් පැත්තත් ඒ විදිහටම තමයි. If imagine that the demand is inelastic, not perfectly but relatively inelastic, and the government provides a subsidy. Then who will enjoy the majority of the subsidy? Again, the consumer, right? And if the supply is relatively inelastic and if the government offers a subsidy, then the suppliers will enjoy the majority of the subsidy benefit. ඔකට මම පොඩි වාට ටේබල් එකක් දුන්නොත් නිකන් මතක තියාගන්න වගේ දෙයක්. මේවා දුන්නයි කියලා මේවා කටපාඩම් කරන එක නෙමෙයි කරන්න ඕන. ඔයා තේරුම් ගන්න එක තමයි කරන්න ඕනි. තේරුම් ගන්නවා notes බලන්න. So let's say on this column we get relative elasticity, right? Relative elasticity. And this is a situation where the government imposes a tax, and this is a situation where the government imposes a subsidy. Now imagine that price elasticity of demand, right, is lower than price elasticity of supply, which means, right, which means demand is relatively inelastic. So let me write demand is inelastic. Demand is inelastic. So if it's a tax, higher portion, right, higher portion is borne by consumer, and if it's a subsidy, again higher portion is enjoyed by again consumer. So it doesn't matter whether it's a tax or subsidy, always a higher portion goes to the consumer if demand is inelastic, right? The second one, imagine that price elasticity of demand is greater than the price elasticity of supply. So what happens? the opposite happens. In this given case, right, in this given case, I can write supply is relatively inelastic. If supply is relatively inelastic, see, higher portion is borne by supplier. Here, if it's a subsidy, higher portion is enjoyed by, again, supply. Right. You can find the answer easily. Right. Look at this one now. Now, in this given case, what is the quality? Supply is inelastic, right? In this case, supply is inelastic. So, the relevant row is this. Supply is inelastic. So, if the supply is inelastic and if this is a subsidy, who will enjoy the majority, the higher portion of the subsidy? The producer. In Sapengane, economic surplus will be distributed between producers and consumers. So, a higher portion goes to the supplier and a lower portion goes to the producer. Majority of the economic surplus will go to customer. No, it will happen if the demand is inelastic, right? Majority of the economic surplus will go to producers. Once again, see, it's the same thing, right? If supply is relatively inelastic, a higher portion of the subsidy is passed to the supplier, producer. So answer is the second one. So no point of reading the other one. If you know this part, you can find the answer easily. Right, look at this question 14 now. In question 14, it says, setting an effective price floor would increase consumer surplus and producer surplus. The second option says increase consumer surplus and decrease producer surplus. Okay, so as we discussed under a previous question, there we discussed about the maximum price, right? Sorry. So this is about the price flow. So price flow is equal to the minimum price, right? It's about minimum price. And if it is an effective minimum price, it is lower, it is higher than the equilibrium price, right? An effective minimum price has to be higher than the equilibrium price. Then අපි කල්පනා කරන්න ඕන. So if the price is higher than the equilibrium price, right? It's good for producers. It's bad for consumers. A price higher than the equilibrium price is always bad for the consumer, good for the producers. එනිසා දැන් අපි අහන්නේ මොකද්ද? What will happen to the consumer surplus and producer surplus? So if the price is bad for the consumer surplus will decrease, and if the price is good for the producer surplus will increase. ඔක තමයි වෙන්න ඕනේ. එහෙනම් see that now, decrease consumer surplus, decrease consumer surplus and then increase producer surplus. So answer is fourth one. Right. 15th, it says an industry with a small number of firms. See that now, ඕවා කියනකොට මෙතින් ඔළුවට එන්න ඕනේ. ඉතින් වැඩක් නැහැ. කියන්නේ ප්‍රශ්නේ ඔළුවේ මැවෙන්න ඕන. Small number of firms නම් එක්කෝ standardized, ඒ කියන්නේ homogeneous, if not differentiated. එහෙමනම් think about the telecommunication service providers in Sri Lanka. We have a small number of firms and they either provide a homogeneous service, if not a differentiated service. So what's the market structure then? Obviously, oligopoly. So competitive, there are a large number of firms. If it's a monopolistic competitive, again, there are a large number of firms. If it's a monopoly, there is only one firm, not small number of firms, not in plural. It has to be in singular then. A pure competition, again, large number of firms, right? So the answer is obviously the second one. Right, look at the 16th one. Consider that a firm employs variable amount of labor to a fixed amount of capital. Okay, so simply the firm is operating in the short run. And then if the daily wage paid to labor increases, how does this affect to firm's cost? Okay, so when you look at the given table, you can understand that they are focusing on total variable cost, total fixed cost, and the total cost. Okay, so let me show you the relationship among these three. So the total of total variable cost and the total fixed cost is equal to total cost. So when the wage increases, what happens to the variable cost? Wage is paid to the laborers. So when the amount of laborers get increased, and if the wage increases, that will affect directly to the variable cost. The laborers, those are variable inputs. So when wage increases, even the total variable cost will increase. And then what will happen to the total fixed cost? There's no change in total fixed cost. Why is that? Because when wage increases, there's no any influence from wage to the total fixed cost, because we don't recognize wages or the laborers to be a part of fixed inputs. No. So it will remain same. And what will happen then? When this increases and when this remains same, what will happen to, there's no change. So let me write here, this is simply 0, so that the total cost will also increase. Now, for example, if this is initially 10 and if this is 5, let's say 50, then the answer is 60. And in the second situation, when total variable cost increases, let's say this is 20 and nothing happens to the total fixed cost, which is still 50, so that this will be 70. So see, when this increases, even this increases. And now what's the answer? This is very easy. Total variable cost increases, total fixed cost, nothing happens. So no change, no change. Yeah, so this is true. And then total cost also increases. Then the answer for this question 16 is the fourth one. Hope you understand that. Right, now look at this 17th question. Consider a farmer who grows banana operates in a perfectly competitive market. Right, so he is operating in a perfectly competitive market. If the market price falls in the short run, okay, so in the short run, for some reason, the market price of banana falls. The farmer should, okay, what is the course of action that should be taken by this farmer? Api kiyala balamu. Increase the production until the price equals average total cost. See that now? If I draw you the curves and show you this properly, then මෙතන කතාව කියන්නේ that is a short run situation, right? In the short run, banana price decreases. හරි. එතකොට වෙන්නේ මෙන්න මේකයි. Normally, imagine that this is the average variable cost, and here we have the average total cost, right? ATC, average total cost. So normally the price equals to the average total cost, right? Price equals to the average total cost in the long run, not in the short run. So that doesn't happen normally in the short run. But in the long run, of course, we recognize this to be the long run equilibrium, right? හැබැයි දැන් farmerට මේ short run එකේ දඩබඩ ගාලා production එක increase කරලා until the price equals the එහෙම වෙන්න බෑ, right? එතකොට අනිත් එක farmerට price එකට influence කරන්නත් බෑ එහෙම. එයාගේ production එක මොකක් වුණත් price will not go up and become equal to the average total cost. මෙයා කොච්චර produce කළා. එතකොට this option is ignorable. Second one says increase production to offset the fall in price. See that now he can increase the production, no problem. If he needs, he can increase the production, but he can't offset the fall in price. මොකද හේතුව? The farmer is just one tiny piece, right? One tiny component in this perfectly competitive market structure. එතකොට the actions taken by a single farmer will not influence the market price. So this is also ignorable there. The third one says discontinue the production. That is also possible. Discontinue the production if the price is less than the marginal, that is the problem. See, if the farmer needs, if the farmer is rational, he can discontinue the production based on a certain condition, but not based on this given condition. ඇයි මම මෙහෙම කියන්නේ? The මේක කියන්නේ continue the production if the new price is less than the marginal. See, the main part of the question is talking about this perfectly competitive market. And if it's a perfectly competitive market, in every single time, price is equal to the average revenue, and average revenue is equal to marginal revenue. Simply, මේ ඔක්කොම සමානයි. And so it will never be less than, price will never be less than the marginal revenue. Producer, farmer make a produce කළත් එකයි, discontinue කළත් එකයි, price will always be same as the marginal revenue. It will not be lower than the marginal revenue. So this is also not relevant there. The fourth one, continue to produce only if the new price covers average fixed cost. එහෙමනම් නෙමෙයි අතරම. Average fixed cost එක cover කරන්න නෙමෙයි we try in the short run. In the short run, we just try to cover at least the average variable cost, because if we can cover at least the average variable cost. Now, let's say, for example, after this price change, the new price is somewhere here, right? See, it's true that this was the previous price, and at the previous price, imagine that they were at the equilibrium earning normal profits, but for some reason, the price falls in the short run, but still they can see that now they are producing this amount, so price must be equal to MC, and MC must be increasing. So this is the level of quantity that the farmer must be producing. When the farmer produces this quantity, see, the farmer can earn this much of price, but the per unit variable cost is only this much. So price is here, the variable cost is here, which means when the farmer produces a certain quantity, right, he receives this whatever the price from the market, and he can cover the variable cost that incurs to produce that quantity, produce that unit, and also there is a surplus, right? There's a surplus, positive value between the price that he receives from the market and whatever the variable cost incurred to produce that product. ඒ නිසා ඒ surplus එක දැන් farmerට පුළුවන් එයාගේ fixed cost එක cover කරන්න use කරගන්න. ඒ නිසා in the short run, the farmer must be trying to cover average variable cost, not the average fixed cost. මොකද එයාට short run එකේ average fixed cost එක cover කරන්න වෙන්නේ නැහැ. The fifth option says continue to produce only if the new price, see that now the exact same thing that we discussed. So that's the answer for this question 17. If the farmer can cover at least the average variable cost, he can use that whatever the surplus that he receives, at least 1 rupee, to cover a part of the total fixed cost. Hence, he can continue operations, right? So answer is the fifth one. We'll move to the 18th question. In the 18th question, it says, if one firm in a perfectly competitive industry experiences a technological breakthrough that lowers only that firm's cost of production. See that now, that is really good. The firm is operating in the perfectly competitive industry, and due to the advancement in technology, they have been able to reduce their production cost. ඒක මාර හොඳයි එතකොට. Then which of the following correctly describes the effect on this firm's price, effect on this firm's price, output and profit? හරි, මේ තුනට මොකද වෙන්නේ කියලා නහන්නේ. සරලව මෙච්චරයි. සරලව කියන්න බෑ, ටිකක් අහගෙන ඉන්න වෙනවා. කතන්දරේ මේකයි. Imagine that in the first situation, the cost curves you get in this way. Right? This is a set of cost curves. So the quantity and the cost and the revenue both, right? Price and revenue all. So this is the, let's say, this is the marginal cost curve, and this is their average variable cost, and somewhere here you find the average total cost. දැන් ඔය වගේ තියෙනවා කියලා අපි හිතමුකෝ. Right, now let me take a copy of this to the other side. එතකොට මේ තියෙන්නේ දෙන්නම එකයිනේ. මේ දෙන්නම එකයි. Right. ඔන්න බලන්න දැන් දෙන්නම එක වුණාට මොකද වෙන්නේ කියලා පොඩ්ඩක් බලාගෙන ඉන්න. Right. So let's assume that the price, right? Price is somewhere here. See, the price comes from the market demand and market supply. So if I draw that curve, I'll show you that as well. So this is the market demand and market supply. So quantity and then price. So imagine that the price is here, right? Imagine that the price is here. So this is the equilibrium price, and that price is taken by the firm, right? This price is taken by the firm. Shape එක එක වගේ පේනවනේ. හරි ඒ ඇති. ඊට පස්සේ මොකද වෙන්නේ? Right now if you calculate the profit, see, the firm must be, I mean, in the initial situation the firm must be producing this quantity. So this is the total. If I zoom this in, right? If I zoom this in, this is the, I mean, this region shows the total revenue, right? This entire region shows the total revenue. And then if you ask me to show the total cost of this firm, ඒක තමයි මෙන්න මේ region එක. මේ තියෙන quantity එක, to produce 1 unit it cost them this much. එතකොට their total cost will be how much then? මෙන්න මෙච්චර. Right? This will be the total cost. The water බැලුවම පේනවා that they can earn a profit of this much. Right? They can earn a profit of this much. ඒක ටික ලස්සනට අපි අඳිමු. So the firm can earn a profit of this much. ලස්සනයි. Yes. And then what happens suddenly? Their technology, they find a new technology from which they can lower the cost. එහෙනම් මොකද වෙන්නේ? මේ price එකට මුකුත් වෙන්නේ නැහැ. Price is still the same නේ. Right? Price is still the same නේ. Price එක එහෙමම තියාගෙන අර cost curves ඔක්කොම මොකද වෙන්නේ? Cost curves ඔක්කොම ටික මම අරගෙන මෙන්න මෙහෙම පහළට කරනවා. පහළට කළා මොකද වෙන්නේ? මේ ටික පහළට ආවේ නැහැ. But anyway, this is ABC and this is ATC. පහළට කළා මොකද වෙන්නේ? See, their MC becomes equal to price, if not MR at this point. So now they are producing somewhere here. And see, if you ask me now, this is Q2. So if you ask me to show the total revenue, wait. This is the total revenue earned by the firm, right? And if you ask me to show the total cost, see, the cost of producing 1 unit is here, so that their total cost must be this entire region. This is the total cost. See, what has happened to their profitability? That has increased. The profitability has increased. Our cost curves ඔක්කොම ටික පහළට යනවා, so that their profitability increases. ඉතින් ඕක තමයි කතන්දරය. ඔය ටික ඔයාලට තේරෙනවා නම් you can understand the answer. එහෙනම් මොකද වෙන්නේ? If okay, which of the following correctly describes the effect on this firm's price, output and profit? Okay, see, price, nothing happens to the price නේ. Price එක අර කළු පාට ඉර ඒක එහෙමම තියෙනවා, so nothing happens to the price. Output, see, when the cost curves decreases, when the cost decreases, they can produce more, obviously, right? When the cost decreases, අපි කලිනුත් කතා කළානේ, when the cost decreases supply increases කියලා. So output increases obviously. And what happens to the profit? මම ඒක ගතියට පෙන්නුවා, the profit increases. So the answer for this question 18 is the fourth one. Right? Hope you understand it. And this next one, 19th one. In the 19th one it says, which phase of the business cycle is most likely to be characterized by an increasing positive output gap. Okay, which phase of the business cycle is most likely to be characterized by an increasing positive output gap? Okay, so what is this positive output gap? What is that actually? The positive output gap is the positive difference between the actual output and the potential output, right? එතකොට මේ බලන්න. If I show you the business cycle in this way, right? If I show you the business cycle in this way, this shows the actual output. And then for the potential output, let me just draw this one, right? Just imagine that this is the potential output. Potential output, right? Now, there is an increasing positive output gap in which one of the following phases. එතකොට දැන් මම කියවනේ positive output කියලා කියන්නේ that is the positive value between the actual output and the potential output. So there was a connection issue. So I was just explaining that this positive output gap is simply the positive gap between the actual output and the potential output. So I was showing this region. See, at this point, what happens? The actual output is higher than the potential output, right? Actual output is higher than the potential output. And this arises in which phase of the business cycle? When it is in the expansion, right? When the economy get expanded, or when the economy is in the expansion phase, you will see a positive output gap. So simply answer is the third one. Very easy. Right, 20th. So to find the answer for the 20th, okay, now we can read that. Which one of the following is a component of gross value added at basic price? See that now, this is very easy. If you remember the theory, that's it. So gross value added at basic price. Basic price is equal to simply factor price, right? This is factor price plus, what is it? Other taxes less subsidies, right? Other taxes less subsidies. When I say other taxes, I mean the taxes and the subsidies on production, right? එතකොට inside the factor price, what do we receive? අපිට අර ටික තියෙනවා මොනවද? අර අපි මේ paper එකේම පළවෙනි question එක කතා කළේ. Sorry, second question එක කතා කළේ. මොනවද තියෙන්නේ? We have rent, we have wages, we have interest, we have profit. See, those are the factor prices. එතකොට ඔය ටික සහ other taxes less subsidies තමයි අපි දකින්නේ inside this GVA at basic price. එච්චරක් simple නේ. එහෙනම් එච්චරක් simple නම් what's the answer? Which one of the following component of which one of the following is a component of the GVA at basic price? එහෙනම් මෙන්න මේ වයින් එකක් වෙන්න ඕනි. මෙතන තියෙන ඒ වයින් එකක් වෙන්න ඕනි. Right. Then we'll read and recognize the correct answer. Intermediate consumption. No, you don't see something like that here. Second one, changes in inventories. Again, no. Acquisition of valuables. No. Taxes less subsidies on the product. Wait. See, then මේකට ගහන්න යන්න එපා. හේතුව this is about the taxes less subsidies on the product. මම කිව්වා මම මෙතන other කියලා ලියන්න හේතුව. Why do we write other here? Because I'm referring to the taxes and the subsidies on the production, not on the product. That's why. So the fifth one says, other taxes and subsidies on production. 100% true. So that is a component inside this equation of calculating GVA at basic price. So answer for this question 20 is the fifth one. Right, now question 21. Which of the following household purchases? Okay, it must be a household purchase. Okay, which one of the following household purchase will be counted as a component of the gross private investment in estimating country's GDP using expenditure approach? Okay, so there are a few things that we need to look for. This must be a household purchase and it must be a part of gross private investment that we consider when calculating GDP under expenditure approach. Okay, so the first one is sovereign bonds. So this is a financial transaction we never consider these when calculating GDP under any of the given approaches. Now here they just talk about the expenditure approach. Expenditure name output the income the किसी में you do not consider the financial transactions. So we can ignore that. Shares of purchase of shares is once again a financial transaction. We don't consider that in any of the approaches. Debenture issued by the investment, see that now. If the household purchases the debentures issued by an investment bank, that is once again a financial transaction. And the fourth one, a new car for personal. I remember that we had the exact same. මේ car එකේ කතාවයි එතන තිබෙන luxury car කියලා මට මතක විදියට බලන්න පරණ paper එකක තිබුණා. ඉතින් a purchase of new car for personal use. හොඳ වෙලාවට personal use කියලා දීලාම තියෙනවා. එහෙනම් we consider this to be a consumption expenditure, not an investment expenditure. And the fifth one, newly constructed house. Again, theoretically, yes, true, we consider houses as a part of capital goods, so that building houses, if not purchasing houses, is considered as an investment under expenditure approach, right? So that's the answer for this question 21, fifth one. Right, now look at this question 22. There it says, which one of the following is considered a property income? So when you hear this property, මොකද ඔලුවට ආවේ? ඔලුවට එනෝනේ මාරම basic දෙයක්. Hope you remember that there are 4 factors of production. The first one is land. We have then labor. Third one is capital, and the last one is entrepreneurship. So out of the 4, these 2, land and capital, how do we recognize them? We recognize them as property resources, right? We recognize them as property resources. So whatever the income that you earn from those, we can recognize to be property incomes. Now, for example, for land, you earn rent, and for capital, you earn interest. So both these you can consider to be property incomes. Simple as that. Then it has to be either rent, if not interest. Wages and salaries, no. Interest, yes. So answer is the second one. Very simple. Right. Question 23. Consider that in an economy, autonomous consumption is rupees 600 million and the marginal propensity to save is 0.2. Okay, so autonomous consumption means this A, which is inside the consumption equation, right? A is given to us as 600 and the marginal propensity to save, MPS, is given to us 0.2. So if MPS is 0.2, obviously MPC has to be 0.8. Right. If national disposable income, okay, look at this one. Disposable income increases by 1,000 million in this economy. Okay, so YD increases by 1,000, right? 1,000 million in this economy. The consumption spending will increase by see then now. If you know the relationship between these two, I mean, the relationship is very simple. Everyone knows that MPS plus MPC has to be equal to 1, right? So if MPS is 0.2, obviously MPC is 0.8. And what's the meaning of this MPC? If your disposable income increases by 1 rupee, you will spend 0.8 rupees for consumption. I think if your disposable income increases by 1,000, then you will allocate 800 for consumption. So answer is the third one. See, it will increase by, I mean, the consumption will increase by 800 million. Simple as that. Right, look at this question 24 now. But before that, we will erase all this. Right, we don't need this. Look at this question 24 now. This says, the table below shows national accounts data on consumption and gross national disposable income for a hypothetical economy. Okay, so we get the consumption and we get the national disposable income. Okay, and then it says An increase in net exports lifted national economy by 300 million in 3 years. If all other things being constant, what was the increase in net exports? Harima saralai habai gati chuttak. So hope you remember that net exports, we consider this to be an autonomous component. So when autonomous values increase, they always create a multiplier effect on the economy, right? They always create a multiplier effect on the national income. So what's that relationship? National income, the change in national income is always equal to the autonomous expenditure multiplier times the change in that autonomous component. Now in this case, it's a change in exports. In the question, they have mentioned that the national economy got increased by 300 million, which means simply the increase in national income. So change in national income is how much? That is plus 300. And then they ask us to recognize the increase in net exports, which means they simply ask us to recognize this delta X. පුළුවන් අපි ළඟ මොකක් තියෙනවද අපි ළඟ මේ k තියෙනවා. So how do we find this k? Hope you remember that this is not the first time that we discussed this. We have discussed this in many of the past paper questions. So the autonomous multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus MPC. එතර 1 over 1 minus දැන් ඔයා මේක දිහා බලාගෙන ඉඳලා හරියන්නේ. You need to find this MPC. How do we find this MPC? MPC is calculated as delta C over delta YD, and that's why in the question we get this table. See, delta C, change in consumption. See, that's 160. Is it? Yes, 160. And the change in disposable income, that's 200. So you can write simply delta C is 160 and this is 200, which is 8 over 10, 0.8. So if you have that value, you can take this here. You can write 0.8 here. Then this is 1 over 0.2 and the answer is 5. Right? Answer is 5. So you can take this 5 here. You can write 5. And then you can find this delta X. See that now. Very easy. So 300 divided by 5 is equal to delta X. So delta X is equal to 60. So the export has increased by 60. That's the answer. 60. Yeah, it's in the fifth option. Right. The question number 25. Short run aggregate supply curve. What is it? Short run aggregate supply curve. Okay. What do they ask then? Slopes down. See, so they are referring to the supply curve and then they say that it slopes downwards. If you have selected this to be the answer, you need to decide whether you go to this A-level exam this year. Right. So if it's a supply curve, it will never, right? It will never slope downward. I think okay when no if it is the short run supply curve, you get the real output. And on this side, you get the price level because it's the aggregate supply curve, right? Price level, not the price level. So the aggregate supply curve will look like this. It's not downward sloping. And the second one is slopes upward and to the right. Yeah, slopes upward to the right. From left to right, it slopes upward. So that's the answer. So no point of reading the other options because this is that much easy. Right? So simply answer for this question 25 is the second one.